These aren't the stories your mother told you. No, these are the other stories.
Today's episode of The Other Stories is I Think My Sock Puppet Hates Me, written by Andy Morris and narrated by Josh Curran.
Bollocks. I think my sock puppet hates me. Max had been trying to dodge this intrusive thought for weeks, but it had become impossible to ignore. He was slumped on his lumpy bed in the corner of his crappy flat. Well, it was more of a bedsit than a flat, but it was all he could afford for himself and Mittens. With a defeated sigh, he turned his hand so the tips of his fingers were facing him. Of course, he couldn't see his fingertips or his hand because these belonged to Mittens, his sock puppet. The red, yellow and green sock with the shiny plastic eyes and lengths of purple wool for hair looked back at him, unblinking. Max felt the disappointment and resentment coming off her in waves. It was hard to tell when things had first started to go wrong between them. He'd made Mittens when he was at school, and like all men, his sock puppet went everywhere with him. Mittens had been with him nearly all of his 21 years, outlasting all his pets and nearly all his friendships. She had accompanied him throughout his school years and when he went into the sixth form to do his A-levels. They had shared birthdays and holidays. She'd been there to witness his first kiss, and she'd been eagerly cheering him on when he lost his virginity to Ginny Tucker. Max and Mittens were inseparable, and that's how things should be. The bond between a man and his sock puppet was sacred and unbreakable. Yet somewhere along the line, things had changed. Mittens had become less animated and seemed bored in his company. She would often sigh and not speak to him for days. He thought she'd be happy after he made her a new shoebox bed, which he kept at the side of his own bed. But no. Max let out another noisy breath and wandered over to the kettle in the corner of the room. He should probably clean the place tomorrow, he reflected, before realizing he'd said the same thing yesterday and the day before. He filled the black plastic kettle with water and flicked it on. The little orange light glowed while the water heated up. As he dropped his tea bag into the cup and added the milk, Max looked down at Mittens, wondering again if she was the reason he had so few friends. She hung there limply at the end of his arm, staring at the floor. Sometimes she would whisper things to him, unkind and hurtful things. She never laughed at his jokes anymore, and when they were on the bus, she would pull faces at the other passengers. He'd been asked to get off and walk the rest of the way on more than one occasion. "Why don't you like me?" Max asked. Mittens turned her head to look up at him. Her black stick-on eyes fixed him with a stare that was as unreadable as ever. She opened her mouth and then closed it again, as if she were about to say something, but changed her mind, thinking better of it. Max picked up his milky cup of tea in his left hand and carried it back to his bed. He did everything with his left hand. Mittens took his right hand from the moment he woke up to the moment he went to bed. That was her hand, and he could no longer use it as he once had. Most boys got used to losing their dominant hand pretty quickly when they got their sock puppets. As Max slumped down on his unmade bed, he thought back to the last, in fact, the only girl he had ever brought home to his flat. Susan had been kind and easygoing. She seemed to like Mittens, and the two of them struck up an easy conversation in the pub while Max sat there feeling a little awkward. When they'd finished their drinks, Mittens had whispered to Max that he should invite Susan back to his flat. To his surprise, Susan accepted, and a short while later, they were passionately kissing on his lumpy bed. Some drama series about a fictional royal family was on the telly in the background. It was only halfway through the first episode when Mittens decided she'd had enough. Without warning, her stripy cotton face twisted into a grimace. She opened her mouth wide like a snake about to swallow its prey. Max barely had time to say, "Hey," before she pounced. Mittens leapt forward and grabbed Susan's face in her mouth. Max shouted at his sock puppet to let go as both he and Susan struggled to pull Mittens off. It took several frantic moments before Susan was free. His would-be girlfriend let rip a stream of expletives before storming out of the flat. Try as he might, Max couldn't get Mittens to say why she didn't like Susan or any other girl he tried to talk to. The sock puppet would always growl and snap at potential dates before he'd even had the chance to be rejected by them. "What's wrong with me?" Max often asked himself. His brother, Rick, had a perfectly good relationship with his sock puppet, Lucy. Lucy was always pleasant and happy to see anyone. She'd often snuggle up to Rick and push her head under his chin as a sign of affection. The same was true with Dad's sock puppet, Jojo. Jojo and Mum got on well too, and there was never a crossed word between them. So why does Mittens hate me so much? The following day, Max was having lunch with Tom, one of his co-workers. Max didn't feel like talking, and before long the conversation dried up. Tom began scrolling through his phone with one hand, while his sock puppet, Matilda, chatted animatedly with Mittens. The pair were busy gossiping about something or other, and Max didn't want to intrude, so he stared out of the window at people walking past. Everyone else's sock puppets were happy, alert, and eagerly taking in the sights, while their owners went about their business. There was one guy, Max noticed, who didn't have a sock puppet. This oddball was wandering about on his own, with nothing on his hands. He'd heard of people like this, and often wondered how they functioned as an adult without having a sock puppet. It made no sense to Max. How could anyone ever take them seriously? Those people must be so sad, weird, and creepy. It was no wonder everyone avoided them. Yet, somehow they seemed to manage their way through life. Managed better than Max was, anyway. When it was time to go back to work, Max and Tom agreed it had been good and they should do it again sometime, although neither of them suggested when or where. Mittens and Matilda embraced in a lively hug, and they needed some gentle encouragement to separate so Max and Tom could return to the office. All afternoon, and well into the evening, Max had been thinking about those eccentric, pathetic men who go around without sock puppets. Maybe they shared his sense of isolation and loneliness. Mittens seemed to be more popular than him, so was there any point in keeping her? Max found himself contemplating joining the circle of freaks who didn't talk to their socks, and used both hands every day. Maybe he should just put his foot inside Mittens and wear her as a normal sock. Mittens snapped her head around at him, shock and revulsion etched into her brightly coloured stitching. Max hastily apologised. Bollocks! What was he thinking? He was no monster. He went to make a cup of tea and tried to forget he'd ever contemplated the idea. As he waited for the kettle to boil, another thought occurred to him. What if he sent Mittens away? Somewhere where she'd be more useful, where she'd feel more fulfilled. Somewhere like Norway. It's cold up there and they always need more socks. Max poured the water onto the milk and tea bag and waited for it to brew. Mittens stared at his cup, and for a moment Max worried she may try to knock it over. That was the kind of mischievous thing she'd do when she was bored or angry with him. He tried to get Mittens to look at the television by way of distraction. They were coming up to the end of season 2 of that royal family drama. Max had grown tired of it, but Mittens still enjoyed it. He fished out the tea bag and dumped it on the side before crossing the room and plunking himself on the bed. Tonight would be a good time to clean his flat, but he just couldn't find the energy. After confirming Mittens' attention was still focused on the telly, he took out his phone and idly swiped through a few apps until he came to one called Sock This. Sock This was a kind of dating app where users could scroll through photos of other people's socks, swipe left to ignore one, and swipe right if they liked one. Max began casually scrolling through the pictures while keeping one eye on the television. After a while, Mittens slowly turned her head and peered over to the top of his screen. Max continued to swipe left. In the past, he would have felt embarrassed that Mittens had caught him looking at a site like this. But now, he no longer cared. It didn't seem to matter anymore. Mittens looked from the phone screen to him and back again, watching which socks he liked and which ones he didn't. After several more swipes, Mittens sprang forward and grabbed his thumb in her mouth. She carefully moved his hand aside, and they both stared down at the screen. It displayed a rugged-looking, dark green woolen sock named Wellington. Wellington was described as hard-wearing, size 9, and made with a specially developed heavy bulk yarn. It was a proper outdoor sock. Mittens began nodding her head excitedly. "You sure? This one?" Mittens continued to nod, her mouth dropping open as if she were panting like a puppy, eagerly waiting for a treat. Max shrugged and swiped right. A few days later, the new sock arrived. Max put it on his left hand, and both sock puppets greeted each other and struck up an instant rapport. They began chatting and laughing together. Max hadn't seen Mittens like this for a long time, and he felt an enormous sense of satisfaction and personal achievement. He sauntered over to his kettle to make a celebratory cup of tea, and it was only then, as he went to add the milk to his empty cup, that he realized his new conundrum. With Mittens on one hand and Wellington on the other, Max had lost the use of both hands. He could no longer make a cup of tea, or do his job, or eat. Oh, he sighed heavily. Bollocks.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Other Stories. I Think My Sock Puppet Hates Me was written by Andy Morris, narrated by Josh Curran, produced by Karl Hughes with music by Dark Fantasy Studio and Tom Robson, and sound effects provided by freesound.org. The episode illustration was provided by Matt Seth Barnes. Joshua Boucher is our story programmer. Jasmine Arch manages our community. Mary Pastrano helps orchestrate the chaos, and the show would collapse into static and screams without the ongoing work of Karl Hughes, Georgia Triantafyllopoulou, and James Barnett, aka Jimmy Horrors. For more of Andy Morris's work, head to blackcattales.weebly.com. Josh Curran is a narrator and writer. He's narrated many episodes of The Other Stories over the show's lifetime. He's also the creator of the horror audio drama podcast, Miscreation. The Other Stories is a production of the Story Studio Hawk and Cleaver and is brought to you with Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. That means don't change it, don't sell it, but by all means share the hell out of it. Until next time.